This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg. Our podcast and YouTube channel, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. If you're wanting to find us on the YouTube channel, just go to YouTube and type in Spirit Matters Talk. And whether you're listening or watching, please hit the subscribe button. We have about 300 shows in our archives, and those are free and open to everyone. And for those that have contributed to keep us on the air, thank you very much. And if anybody would like to do that, just go to spiritmatterstalk.com and it'll tell you what to do. Have a fascinating guest today, Akash Kapur. He is the author of the book, Better to Have Gone, Love, Death, and the Quest for Utopia in Auroville. He's a true scholar. He's a graduate of Harvard University and was a Rhodes Scholar, has a degree from graduate degree from Oxford. And he was a columnist, letter from India for the International New York Times, and the recipient of the Whiting Grant. So today we want to discuss his book, amongst other things. And I want to thank you very much for taking the time, Akash, for taking the time to come on with us today.
Of course, it's my pleasure.
Akash, I heard your interview with Terry Gross, and I was intrigued and thought it would be great to have you on our program. We're dedicated to topics around contemporary spirituality, and a lot of our listeners have either tangible or spiritual connections to India, and Sri Aurobindo has had a big influence on many of us. And so your experience growing up in Auroville and the memoir, which sounds really intriguing, sounded like a very interesting topic for us to explore. Give us a little bit about, I know your whole book is your story, of growing up in Auroville and going back. Tell us a little about the reason you wrote the book and what the sort of central premise is, and then we can
and also I think most of our listeners or viewers probably are not tremendously familiar with Auroville, so just some points on that.
Sure. So Auroville, hard to summarize. I call it an intentional community, located in South India, based very much on the teachings and the philosophy of Aurobindo. I think it's intended as a kind of laboratory for his teachings. It's a complex place. It can be simplified as a utopia, but it's not a utopia. It's a human kind of organic lived reality. It's been around for a long time now. It's got about 3,000 people in it, and it's been around for more than 50 years. So I grew up there, as did my wife, actually, who features very much in this book. We both grew up there. And then we each went our separate ways in the world. As you mentioned earlier, I was a student in the US and then England. What happened is that we were living in Brooklyn at some point. And my wife had a kind of unusual history in Auroville, which is sort of the central premise of the book, which is that her mother and her adoptive father, who was very much like a father to her, died in quite strange circumstances when she was about 14 years old. And she was adopted by his family and left Auroville, and it was always sort of mysterious what had happened. And I think it was that mystery that in many ways drew us back to Auroville, the attempt to sort of solve that or uncover that or figure out what had happened. So we got into that. And then what happened is that I discovered a cache of letters and diaries from both of them, both of the dead people. And that just sort of opened up worlds, not only concerning their deaths and their lives, but the wider kind of social world of Auroville in the 70s and the 80s and what was going on in the community. And so the book grew out of that.
And when you went back, was it a big decision to go back? Was there a lot of conflict between you and your wife, or not between you and your wife, within each of you internally in making that return and actually ultimately deciding to continue to live there?
Not really, like we were pretty young, and the young can be kind of impulsive and don't think through the consequences of things very carefully. And so I think we just sort of you know, we just kind of like, we did it. And to, you know, also I should say that part of the reason we moved back, part of it was very much for Auroville and to be back in Auroville, but also we were very attracted to India. I mean, this was the early 2000s, and it felt like India was really changing, and there was a lot happening in India. And so, you know, I think some of it was actually just kind of homesickness. And we wanted to be back there. And I'll say one more thing was that this was also when the Iraq war was happening in the US, and we felt very alienated by that, and like we didn't want to be part of that, the second Gulf War.
Mm. And it probably wasn't safe.
It wasn't that it was unsafe. It just felt like there was something very strange going on, and there were very strange forces kind of unleashed and afoot, and it felt weird to be part of that. I mean, I reference in the book, I remember one day riding the subway in New York and seeing, it was a spread of images from the Gulf War in the New York Times of sort of soldiers in an orange dust storm. And I thought, my God, there's this crazy war going on. I don't want to be part of this. I don't relate to this. This seems like such a horrible mistake, which of course it turned out to be.
And India is a very big place. You could have gone there. You could have lived in Pondicherry near the ocean. But you went back to Auroville, where you had grown up, where there were no doubt mixed feelings, because you probably, you know, had happy memories of childhood, but there was also darkness in what had happened to your wife's family. And I've spoken to a few people who go to Auroville on a regular basis and are Sri Aurobindo sort of devotees. And they were curious about why you went back, if you know, honestly, and what it was like to go back and live as a grown-up in you know, in the intentional community you grew up in, which had, you know, you write about in your book as having, you know, a lot to going for it, but also some dysfunction.
Yeah, I mean, I should say that the darkness was certainly true for my wife, and so it was probably more complicated for her. In my case, there wasn't a lot of darkness, to be honest. I mean, I had a pretty magical childhood in Auroville, and I felt and still feel. I mean, it's a complicated place, and I'm an adult, and I see the complexity of it. But I was very attached to it, and I very much felt its potential. And also, I had a lot of emotional ties there, of course, you know, with friends and family members. So it wasn't really such a hard choice for me to go back. I mean, I always figured, especially with the world having changed, that there was a way to live in Auroville while still being connected to the world. I mean, I think for the early pioneers, including my parents, who set up in Auroville in the 70s in the kind of pre-internet age, it was really a much bigger choice. It really meant kind of cutting off the world, right? I mean, you know, those were the days where, I mean, I remember even when I was a kid, and this was later, if you wanted to call somebody in America, you had to book a trunk call far ahead, and it was just
Right.
very hard. That wasn't the case when we went back. You know, I could read the New York Times every day. I could like email my friends in the world. So there wasn't that much conflict within me. And then the other thing I would say is that one of the great success stories in Auroville, which was very compelling in terms of returning, and this is sometimes unacknowledged, is the amazing ecological restoration work and green work that they've done there. So when people think of Auroville, they tend to focus a lot on the kind of spirituality and you know, and then sometimes if they're in a negative frame of mind, they focus on all the ways that the spiritual ambition has fallen short and that everybody's still like a mere mortal. But really one of the great unacknowledged successes is that they took this desert and they turned it into probably the most successful reforestation project in India. And particularly if you know something about the kind of environmental calamity that exists in most of India and the unlivability of most Indian cities, I mean, Auroville is a wonderful place to live, just at a kind of geographical, physical level.
Yeah, let me add to that, Dennis, a minute. I was there twice. And the last time I was there is just before the pandemic became news, last January of 2020. And I took a tour group to India, and we were there for a day. And one of the things that did impress everybody was the ecological commitment of the people at Auroville, and the availability of organic food at the restaurants and all that sort of thing. How has it changed since your childhood when it was first being set up as a utopian sort of vision, and how is it different now?
Yeah, it's changed a lot. I mean, 50 years, at this point it's 53 years is a long time. And so the early days, I mean, well, much more intense, for better and for worse. First of all, the sort of natural habitat was very, very harsh. There were none of these trees. It was really hot, and water was a sort of luxury. There was none of this kind of like thriving organic food industry that you just referred to. It was pretty harsh. It was much smaller. There was also a kind of intensity in the idealism of the early founders, which, as I described in my book, was for better and for worse. Now, 50 years later, it's much more settled. It's much more, if some people would lament that because they would say it's become more bourgeois and kind of middle class. And I do understand that complaint. I think idealism is a complicated thing. I described some of the very difficult, kind of dangerous places that too much idealism led Auroville into when I was a kid. And so you have the kind of like the purity of the fire, but you also have, the burning quality of the fire. And I think that Auroville is, I wouldn't say it's a normal place because it's still a very unusual place, but it's more normal than it was when I was growing up. I mean, the other thing is that the schools, when I was a kid, education was a very controversial thing there, and I described this in my book. The schools were shut down. There was at a certain point there was a movement against education because it was seen as old world, and that was something. I mean, it was very harmful, and a lot of people are still bearing the scars of that. And now Auroville has excellent schools, has these multicultural schools for the community.
Moved to another town when that was the case, so that you could attend school?
I did. My parents pulled me out for a few years, and we moved to Pondicherry, and I enrolled in the ashram school there, which was more solid. But many people, including my wife, didn't, and they had sort of improvised educations. There were always certain adults that were continuing education, and so some of them emerged okay, and some of them didn't. It was sort of luck of the draw, and a lot of it had to do with how persistent their parents were on insisting that they have an education.
Akash, I wanted to ask you about the French woman who Mira Alfassa referred to as mother in the community. Did you have a relationship? Did you have a lot of interaction with her as you were growing up and living there? And how did she set the tone for the community? And when she passed, were there a lot of big changes that took place?
Yeah, so I was born about a year after she passed away. So I never, met her directly. That being said, I would say she played a major role in my life because she was the founding figure of Auroville. And many people I grew up with were, very reverential and had interacted with her and had life-changing sort of moments, just by meeting her once. So it was, of course, she was a huge presence in my life. I think, the question of what happened after she passed away is really interesting, and it goes to the heart not only of Auroville's history, but intentional communities in general, because the community went through some very, very tough times after she passed away. And that's often what happens in such communities, that they sort of, as long as there's a founder to kind of hold it together and who's able to command, loyalty and make decisions, both big and small, things kind of seem to be headed in a positive direction. And then when they fall apart, all kinds of human egos and rivalries and, just our kind of chronic inability to get along and our tendency to disagree and bicker and fight come out. And so I would say, again, I write about this in the book, I would say that Auroville went through a near-death experience in the 70s. It really almost fell apart, and they were very difficult times. And I think, it's pretty amazing that Auroville is still there 53 years later, because it wasn't a given. It really wasn't a given, especially when we look back at it now and realize, what was going on. There was a lot of factionalism and infighting and sort of conflict between the ideological purists and the people who were more realist. So
in my experience, a lot of spiritual organizations, especially ones that have communal component to it, after the founder is gone, there's this sort of battle between the orthodox and the more liberal kind of contingencies, and sometimes the orthodoxy wins and things get very cultish and destructive. And sometimes the liberal faction wins and it loses touch with the original intent in time. So is that kind of what happened? And is any of that still extant in Auroville?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely what happened. That's a perfect kind of, archetypal description of what happened in Auroville. And I agree that this is a common trope. And there was a major battle between, the purists and the less pure. And I, in my book, I pretty clearly come down on the side of the non-purists, because partly having lived through those years, I'm not a great believer in orthodoxy and sort of rigid ideology. I just think that when confronted with like the complexity of humanity and human nature, it always ends up in a bad place. This is sort of my view of not only these communities, but of history. I mean, this is what's played out, whether you're talking about the French Revolution or Cambodia or the Soviet Union. This is what we see happening. The question about whether it's still playing out is an interesting one, because certainly you still have these two sort of, I don't want to say factions because they're not so well defined, but these two tendencies within the community. By its definition, a place like Auroville attracts people who are true believers and truly committed. And they may, by the way, be serial true believers and serial true committers. They may have moved from one cause to another one. But yeah, it creates conflict within the community. And I think, I mean, I've had a lot of notes since the book came out from people in the community. I was quite nervous about how the book would be received. I've had a lot of notes that are fairly positive, and with people saying that they see resonances in the current moment with what happened all those decades ago. I think that COVID and the difficulties of COVID have shaken things up, as they have in much of the world. And then it's interesting because many of the sort of forces that you might have seen emerge at a kind of grand political level around the world, there's certain extremism and things that have come out around the world, you see playing out in smaller communities too.
Right. I'm curious, is the children in Auroville now, where do they attend school? Do they have their own school? And if so, what's that like? And do you have kids in the school? And I would imagine from my own experiences in similar situations that within the school, that's where you also get a lot of battling between the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox in whatever the belief or spiritual system is.
Yeah, I mean, the schools actually are great. Like my kids have been in school there from the age of 2, basically. They started in pre-creche, and so I'm a great champion of the schools. I mean, I think it's wonderful. I think that they have all the best of kind of like community schools in the sense of devoted teachers who are essentially part of your extended family and really care about the kids. Combined with an oddly kind of multicultural feel, because Auroville is this very international town. So
right. I saw the makeup of the community. It's amazingly international.
Yeah, well, and that's part of the idea, right? Human unity and
right.
stuff. So, and also, a pretty good balance between structure, which was lacking when I was a kid, but not too structured, right? Like not teaching to exams. And so structure, but also like openness and cultivating kind of, creativity or ways of thinking. So I think the schools are really great, really I do, and I think it's one of the great successes in the community. Those battles that you referred to are certainly, education is often a battlefield for that kind of conflict. They played out very much in the 70s and the early 80s. They still exist in the community. What I see happening is that they don't tend to play out that much within a given school, thankfully, although it could happen. People tend to come and like start their own schools. So actually you have a variety of schools in the community, some of which are much more open-ended and less structured, and some of which are quite structured. And this, leaves a little room for both schools to exist without falling apart on the conflicts, and also for parents to kind of choose about, which school they want to put their kids in and which path they want to follow.
I want to follow up, Phil. In the school that your kids are in, is there a specific spiritual practice that's incorporated into the school? And what grade does the school go up to? And is it a big transition when kids go to college, which is something you did yourself coming from that school?
Yeah, there isn't really, I mean, thankfully there hasn't been an attempt to really impose a kind of like ideology or orthodoxy on kids. I mean, there is some amount of tension about like how much of the mother and Sri Aurobindo should they be reading and at what age? And I think there are probably people in the community who think that maybe the school should be doing more of that, because after all, isn't that the purpose of Auroville? And then you would have some people involved in education or some parents who say, well, sure, expose them to spiritual ideas and the notion of spiritualism. But in my experience, kids need to discover this stuff for themselves. I mean, I was spoon-fed it a little bit as a kid. And honestly, it took me like 30 some years to let go of the resulting skepticism. It was the process of writing this book that like helped me kind of like turn to faith with like a slightly more kind of positive approach. So the kids do yoga, they learn to meditate, they sort of, they learn about mind-body connections, but there isn't too much, attempt to impose sort of teachings on them. The transition, yeah, it can be difficult. I mean, I did it when I was in my late 16s, almost 17. I went to boarding school in the US. It wasn't easy. I mean, I would guess academically was actually one of the easier parts, which is probably a testament to the quality of the schools. Obviously, socially and culturally, it's a pretty big leap. I would suggest that maybe today it's less of a leap again, given sort of the internet and the global culture and the fact that, for better or for worse, kids in Auroville are on Snapchat and Facebook and Instagram and things like that. Whereas I was not watching like all the American TV shows that my friends spoke about when I moved to America in the 90s.
Mm-hmm. For the listeners and viewers who are not familiar with it, I should point out that Pondicherry is this charming coastal town that was a French colony, and that's where Sri Aurobindo went to get away from the British rulers when he was a young revolutionary. And then he developed an ashram there as a spiritual force and a spiritual teacher, and was revered in India. And when he died in 1950, it was after that the woman known as the mother established Auroville. So Sri Aurobindo was never there. And the ashram in Pondicherry and the schools around it and all that are really centered around Sri Aurobindo's spiritual teachings and his integral yoga. And my impression is that that connection is less pronounced in Auroville, even though people often describe it as a cult. That doesn't sound like an accurate description, because it's pretty decentralized and focused on how do we live together as opposed to following a teaching at this point anyway. It may have been different in your childhood. Is that a correct assumption?
I think so. I mean, I think that I think that the teachings are quite central, but in a more private way. So there's not a lot of public ceremony. And again, there's tensions. There are people who probably think there should be more of it. But I would, the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the mother are quite central to many people's lives. And there's a lot of private effort to participate in what's referred to as the yoga, right? Which is a form of self-cultivation and spiritual advancement. But it is more private and it is less regimented than a kind of traditional spiritual retreat. I mean, Sri Aurobindo had this, beautiful line. Like the line was "all life is yoga," and because part of his sort of philosophy or his teaching was to sort of extract Indian spirituality from this sort of ascetic withdrawal from the world that it had fallen into, and to infuse everyday life with more spirituality or spiritual purpose. And so I think, for a lot of people in Auroville, building the city is a form of yoga. It's actually a spiritual practice. There's a kind of devotional aspect to it. The thing about Auroville being a cult, that's come up in a few sort of like reviews of my book. Yeah. And I was surprised, to be honest. In retrospect, I shouldn't have been surprised. Like, it's, people need categories, and I guess like, is it a kibbutz or is it a cult or what is it? So, and I certainly, it's not that I don't see why anybody would characterize it as that, but people have asked me that, and look, I've written this book, which I wouldn't say it's not a takedown of the community, but it's certainly critical of certain aspects that happened. I don't feel, that I'm going to be burned at the stake. Like, so I don't, it doesn't feel like a cult to me. And I always say, well, I wouldn't bring my kids up in a cult, at which point some people look at me and think like, false consciousness, he's fooling himself. Well, maybe, I don't know.
It's interesting. My experience is people from what we would call mainstream religions like to look at smaller groups, spiritual groups, and call them cults because, and when you really reflect on what they're saying, they're talking more about what they are than what those communities often are. I have two final questions for you. One would be, what do you hope people get out of the book? And is your community one that you would like and encourage people to visit? I certainly would be very curious to visit there.
What do I hope people get out of the book? I mean, I hope they get a good reading experience. I worked hard. I worked hard on the writing. I don't mean to sound flippant about it. I worked hard on the writing, so I hope that they enjoy it as a read also. But like I hope that they get a sense of the complexity of this place. I hope they get a sense of the organic reality of the place. And I tried to be honest. I tried to say it's an amazing place. There are all kinds of amazing things happening. Yes, there are some pretty not amazing things that have happened, and there are some, but that's, to me, that's part of the kind of human charm and beauty of the place. That where I come down is it a utopia? No. Has it achieved all that it set out to achieve? By no means has it. But it's trying, and that's something. I mean, there are many places, I know many places in the world that are not trying. And so I really appreciate Auroville and Aurovillians for really trying to create an alternative. And I was very grateful, by the way, for the reviews that saw that, because there were reviews that would be very positive about the book, but then sort of be like dismissive of the community and why would he go back? But some of them were both positive about the book, and despite seeing all the flaws in Auroville, would say, but we still recognize why this place is special and why it needs to exist. So that's kind of what I, hope people to get out of the book. The other question was about visitors. Yeah, I'm a little bit of a curmudgeon about tourism. I mean, so, tourism has hit Auroville pretty hard, in my opinion, over the last decade. And I have to say, one of the reasons that I moved to Auroville, that I love living there, is a sense of kind of being cut off from the world and having a little space. And so I'm a little mixed about tourism. And I guess it's certainly, people who have a kind of genuine interest in spirituality or in alternative living or ecological sort of stuff. I think they should visit, and it's a wonderful place. But I am a little bit down on day trippers who come in to get the good French croissant or the organic food. I mean, again, some of my friends in Auroville think I'm too negative about this because it is part of the economy now and it helps sustain the place. Yeah. And I suppose for every 100 of those people that come in as day trippers, a couple of them will end up, touching something deeper and staying. So, yeah, I've been known to be a little unfriendly to tourists. something I'm trying to work on,
Well, I was there twice, and once I was by myself and I stayed for a few days. I remember spending time with Astor Patel, who you probably know. And then the second time last year, it was part of a tour group that I led, but it was a very spiritual group, and they were put off by all the tour buses.
Yeah.
And we contributed to the economy. A lot of T-shirts were bought, and lunch was had. And so I guess I can understand the sort of mixed feelings about it. Akash, the writing received tremendous reviews, even from people who may have gotten Auroville wrong. The writing in the book was received, great plaudits. And part of that was that there's a kind of mystery woven through it, which is about the circumstances of your wife's parents' deaths at a tragic early age. Can you tell us something about that and what you discovered? Because it kind of speaks to the fanaticism of the place in those days.
Yeah. So without giving away, plot twists, the book is set up as a mystery. I mean, we know from the beginning that these two people have died young, and that my wife, their daughter, doesn't understand the full circumstances of it or why, and that it's sort of grown into mythology and legend in the community over time, and that it's kind of shrouded in mystery. And so as I was unpacking this, and I talked to hundreds of people, I read all their letters and diaries, I mean, you learn the specific circumstances of their deaths, and I write about that. But I think more revealingly, at least for me, was you learn the way that their private fates intersected with the kind of communal trajectory. And so for us, the insight was that these were not just two isolated deaths of individuals who had gone too far into their faith and their yoga, which is, also true, but that really there was sort of forces at work in the community, and there were tendencies in the community that I think pushed them into that corner. So I'm not saying that anybody in the community murdered them or anything, nothing like that happened, but they got caught up in the fanaticism of the era. They got caught up in a general tendency to take idealism too far. Idealism is a beautiful thing, but the conclusion I come away with from this book is that it exists on a spectrum. And just like faith as well, there's a beautiful, noble aspect to it, and there's a destructive, harmful, fanatic aspect to it. And so that intersection of the kind of individual fates and communal fates was sort of one of the main things I took away from figuring out their deaths.
Thank you very much, Phil. Anything else?
Yeah, I'm curious how going back and being in Auroville, how has it affected you and your wife in a spiritual way? Do you have a different spiritual outlook now than you might have when you first moved back to Auroville? How do you feel about the teachings of Sri Aurobindo at this point as compared to the past?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it was something that for me, a lot of this happened through the book. As I referenced earlier, I mean, I start off as fairly skeptical about many of these things, which is not to say utterly negative about it, but I've seen sort of the dark side of faith, and I've seen where it leads, and I've seen fanatics in my lifetime. And so I start off being skeptical and in retrospect, fairly closed to it. And I really surprised myself, and I have this at the end of the book in an epilogue. I really surprised myself because I end up in a much more kind of open place. And I say, that it's not that I wouldn't say that I have found faith. I think that would be overstating it. But it's like I've seen a door open, and I've understood that it's possible to walk through that door. And part of that is because talking to all these people and reading all these letters, I was sort of forced to deal with and engage with the beauty of their own faith and their own quest, right? And it's complicated because, you referred to my wife's parents. They died because of their faith. But along the way, there was so much nobility and so much inspiration to their quest that I had to hold these two ideas in my head at the same time, the kind of destructive place they end up, but the beauty of the quest. And I think that sort of reconnecting with that nobility and that beauty it was wonderful in a way, and it did change my relationship to faith and the pursuit of spirituality.
Great.
My take on I have great admiration for Sri Aurobindo, and to the extent I can read him, he was a very practical guy and a very much in the world spiritual guy, and would probably have great respect for your own, clear thinking and rational approach to these matters. That's how I saw him anyway, because he was a giant intellect, and didn't seem to suffer fools easily in his day. And my last question to you is, the Sri Aurobindo influence is felt in America largely in the San Francisco Bay Area, where devotees of his were teaching in his name and around his work going back into the 1950s. And the California Institute of Integral Studies was originally started as a sort of place to foster the sort of East-West psychology of Sri Aurobindo. Do you have contact with the people there? Have they contacted you or read the book?
Not specifically with that institution, no. I mean, I know a lot of Aurovillians and former Aurovillians who live in the US. So I have contact with people who are connected to and plugged into Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, but not specifically that institution.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And we look forward. I encourage the book. We'll have all the information about the book up.
Great.
And for those listening or watching, if you have any questions, you can direct them to us, and we can forward them. And fascinating, and something I'll be looking into and excited about myself, and really getting into the book and very thought provoking.
Okay, and one, Akash, when I was looking into, when I was preparing for this interview and reading reviews, and when I went to your website, I realized I had heard your name in connection to your previous book, which I haven't read but wanted to. Tell us the name of the book about India and this modernization.
Yeah, it's called India Becoming.
India Becoming. I remember reading reviews because I've been to India many times and I've seen it becoming, and so I want to see your take on it. Now we'll have to get it, so we'll recommend that as well. Okay, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for coming on.
Thanks a lot. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, take care.
Phil, that was Akash Kapur, a fascinating man. He grew up in an intentional community in India, went to boarding school when he was 17 in the States, went on to become a Rhodes Scholar, highly educated, excellent writer, very articulate. And for me, it was particularly fascinating because I live in Fairfield, Iowa, which is also an intentional community, or at least an aspect of the town is, and another town that came into being, Vedic City, is absolutely an intentional community. So a lot of the things he said, I related to, and I just found them fascinating.
There are similarities, also big differences. For one thing, Auroville was started, on a barren piece of land, and based presumably on the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the mother. So it has in common with the Fairfield, Iowa community that it was created around a specific set of spiritual teachings. But Fairfield was the home of the university first, and then a community around it, which was kind of different. And Auroville was organized to be an intentional community, whereas Fairfield just sort of became a community.
But many of the things he said, I related to about the evolution and growth of a community, and it's the orthodoxy, the more progressive elements of it. It was fascinating. Also, I spoke to somebody. We're doing this discussion a day or so after we actually did the interview, and I ran into a friend of mine, and I mentioned Auroville in the interview with Akash, and he said he actually spent 2 or 3 weeks in Auroville, really, really liked it, had wonderful things to say about it, stayed with a family who was very involved in that intentional community. And he said what was interesting to me was, he said there were many subcultures in the community.
That's right.
That's right. Tell us about that. You've been there.
Yeah, there are people who are real, who spent a lot of time there, could say a lot more than I. But it's interesting because it's a vast, proper piece of land. I mean, it's huge, and it's from downtown Pondicherry, where the Sri Aurobindo ashram is. It's quite a drive. It's a 45-minute or so drive to the center of Auroville. And in Auroville, there's a sort of centerpiece where there are, offices and shops and restaurants and all that, and tourists. That's where tourists come.
It's like a downtown, even though it's a town.
It's a little kind in a sense.
A main drag.
But we didn't mention is they have this enormous sort of meditation dome, gold dome called the Matra Mandir. And that's essentially a pilgrimage place. And it's a fascinating place. I've been inside, but you have to make reservations. and it's not easy to do, and there's only a certain number of people at certain times can go inside, and inside is this incredible space.
Don't you have to maintain silence
meditation.
at all times? It's a
But
silence.
around Auroville, there's different sort of pockets with homes of different size and different kinds, and there's sort of subgroups, that have developed. A lot of different people come for different reasons. They have different orientations. They're from different countries.
I saw the breakdown in terms of countries that are represented in the community, and it was amazing. I mean, probably 80 countries.
Yeah, it's very international. So it's a fascinating place, and it's not uniform. And the connection to Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga and his teachings is kind of tenuous in a certain way, because, as time went by, some of the people there just were more interested in creating a utopian community and with education and dealing with
a big commitment to environmental issues as well.
Big environmental programs and award-winning and very innovative ecological programs going on there. And so people got more interested in that and the dynamics of a group living, and communal living, than in the spiritual teachings of Sri Aurobindo, and others remained dedicated to that and wanted to be more central to the operation. So it's an interesting sociological phenomenon.
It was also interesting to me that critics of the community, which you'll always have no matter what you do, will use the word cult often, and usually, and especially in this case, I'm sure those are people that have very little familiarity, or they have some axe to grind, or they're just against any new communities and anything that has to do with Sri Aurobindo or whatever like that, because yes, often what we consider mainstream religion can be categorized as cultish also. So I think you could tell there was a frustration, which I totally understand on Akash's part when people mention those things, and even frustration with too many tourists that just want to come in and eyeball the place, get a real superficial look at it. Oh, I was at Auroville, as opposed to really looking more deeply as to what.
The tourist buses come, people from, all on a tour of South India, and they'll say, oh, then we'll spend half a day at Auroville, and we'll go at lunchtime when you can have lunch at the organic restaurant or something. And so there's tour buses, but they bring in a lot of money, so, and people need that.
Need to keep the
but
community
the thing about cults, you and I know how easy it is where journalists just call something a cult.
Right.
And it has these terrible connotations.
Right.
And, any spiritual group, an outsider is likely to say, especially if it's not a mainstream group, they'll call it a cult. But as cults go, compared to, some of the really egregious cults that operate within mainstream religions in many cases. I just watched on HBO Max a 3-part series about a real, Christian cult in Nashville that was really out there and destructive to people's lives. So, what constitutes a cult and what's just, a healthy spiritual organization that, people benefit from, that's a matter of opinion in many.
Yeah, I've often thought that. I mean, I remember I visited many times Trappist monastery. So it's within Catholicism. It's a monastery where a group of men or women, I went to the one where there were men, live there. There's a head person, an abbot, and they spend most of the day in prayer and meditation, and they have to follow a routine. And is that a cult? I mean, some people could call that a cult. I thought it was a wonderful place. People come there by choice. Some people stay. A lot of people leave. They enjoy it. It's a choice. So it's, but it would be very easy for somebody to come along and say, oh, they're very cultish. They listen to this head guy all the time, and they follow this book called the Bible, and on and on like that. So I think
Yeah.
before anybody uses the word cult, you should really, which you can use,
You know,
you should think about what
and
you're
then
saying, what it means.
a lot of spiritual organizations, if they have big followings, there's degrees of involvement. So if you get really deep into the core, the nucleus of the hierarchy and everything, where people are really
Right.
dedicated, it has more cult-like qualities.
Right.
And then there's people on the peripheries, like,
Right.
you go to Fairfield, Iowa, where there are people who are deeply involved in the TM organization, and you could say there's cult-like qualities in the core of it. On the other hand, they can leave. Nobody's
Right. It's like I have a friend
it's
that's
not like where they possess you and tell you how to
right.
live. But on the
Yeah.
periphery are all these millions of people who just learn to meditate, and they have nothing to do with anything
Right.
cult-like.
Yeah. And
So-
if you go to Crown Heights in Brooklyn, and you see the group of Lubavitch,
Oh, yeah.
the city folks, very orthodox in the Jewish faith, and you could say this or that about them. But I have friends that are part of that community that it's
Hey, you want to
very
see
unfair to say things like that.
you want to see a cult in operation? Go to a Trump rally.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a irrational beliefs, and Anyway, hey, let's mention the book one more time.
The title of Akash's book, and I don't have it with me, so they'll have to just read it on our website and YouTube channel.
Yes, and what do we have coming up, Phil?
Oh, we have some great stuff coming up in the next few months, but we don't want to announce it because we haven't done the interviews yet.
Right. And by the way, the title of Akash's book, which I have, Better to Have Gone, Love, Death, and Quest for Utopia in Auroville. Akash Kapur, now available, and just
It's gotten great reviews.
Wonderful writer.
He is. Oh, he's a professional. He's a real journalist. So the writing is good, and it's been very well reviewed by people of respectable reviewers. So it's a good read. Okay, Dennis.
Right.
Next time. Hey, listeners, push the subscribe button.
Yes, please.